Welcome to Eggs and Issues, a monthly business forum presented by the Portland Community Chamber of Commerce, bringing timely economic discussion to the region for nearly 40 years. Thank you to our sponsors and partners. Presenting sponsors, Bank of America, Martins Point Healthcare, and Central Maine Power. Cooperating sponsor, Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare. Reception sponsors, Clark Insurance, Key Bank, and Pretty Flaherty. Community Corner sponsor, Goral Palmer. Tomorrow's leaders and entrepreneurs sponsors, AAA Northern New England and ProSearch. Coffee sponsor, Skowhegan Savings. Parking sponsor, Vitalius Real Estate Group. Media partners, radio sponsor, WGAN. Print sponsor, The Forecaster. TV sponsor, WMTW Maine CW. Business news sponsor, Maine Biz. With production support provided by Headlight. Venue partner, Holiday Inn by the Bay. And thank you to our special community partners, Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield, Memic, Spectrum Healthcare Partners, Southern Maine Community College, and the University of Southern Maine. And now, please welcome Portland Community Chamber President, Britt Vitalius.
I know I don't look like Britt. I have more hair than Britt. But good morning, everybody. Happy Friday. Happy Good Friday. I hope you enjoyed this morning's soundtrack, which we think was the best of the Cars. We think they played the entire album this morning. I am Quincy Hensel. I'm the CEO of the Portland Regional Chamber, and I am here for Britt, who is unavailable to join us this morning. So again, thank you for being here. I think this is, we have 2 more Eggs and Issues after this one before our season wraps up. So it's always great to see a room full of people on these mornings. So today we have a really great presentation. We're gonna hear from a panel of individuals who are very deeply connected to the topic of transportation. And we're gonna talk about specifically the ways that the pandemic has changed the way we travel and what the future of transportation looks like in our region. And earlier this morning, I was talking to Greg Jordan, who you are going to meet in a minute as one of our panelists. We did an Eggs and Issues on this topic, I think in late 2019, for those of you who maybe joined us. It was fantastic. There was a lot of energy in the room, a lot of employers who were here who were excited to look at ways they can encourage their employees to participate in public transit, and then the pandemic happened. So we are excited to be here today to kind of breathe some new life into this topic and to, again, see ways that the employer community can engage in the great things that are happening around transportation in our region. So before I invite the panelists to the stage, I do want to take a moment to thank all of our generous sponsors who make this event possible. First and foremost, our presenting sponsors, who are Bank of America, Martins Point Healthcare, and Central Maine Power. Our cooperating sponsor is Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare. Reception sponsors are Clark Insurance, Key Bank, and Pretty Flaherty. Our community corner sponsor is Goral Palmer. And today's Community Corner, joining us this morning, is Hurricane Island Outward Bound School. Established in 1964, Hurricane Island Outward Bound is a nonprofit educational organization and expedition school that serves people of all ages and backgrounds through active learning expeditions that inspire character development, self-discovery, and service, both in and out of the classroom. It delivers programs using unfamiliar settings as a way for participants across the country to experience adventure and challenge in a way that helps students realize they can do more than they thought possible. Their mission is to change lives through challenge and discovery. That sounds pretty awesome. I know we have some people here today from our Community Corner. If you're here, please stand to be recognized. What a great initiative. Thank you so much for being here. And if you'd like to learn more about Hurricane Island, you can visit, they have an upcoming event on May 11th, and you can visit hiobs.org. or stop by their table on the way out. Thank you again for being here. Moving on again to our sponsors, tomorrow's leaders and entrepreneur sponsors are AAA Northern New England and ProSearch. And through this program, the Chamber is able to offer students in the region, both high school and college, an invitation to attend Eggs and Issues at no cost. I believe we might have some students here today from USM. If you raise your hand if you're here. Looks like they maybe slept in this morning. Or studying. Someone's like, they're studying. I'm sure that's the case. Our coffee sponsor, thank you to our coffee sponsor, Skowhegan Savings. Parking sponsor, Vitalis Real Estate Group. A special thank you to our media partners, The Forecaster, WGAN, WMTW Mains, CW, Main Biz, and Wohler & Company. Our For More Information sponsor is Portland Public Library. Production support, Headlight Audiovisual, thank you in the back. Our venue, thank you to Holiday Inn by the Bay. And a very special thank you to our special community partners who support everything we do throughout the year. They are Anthem, Spectrum Healthcare Partners, University of Southern Maine Community College, and MEMIC. So with that, please, another round of applause for all of our sponsors. Okay, and now on to today's presentation. So as we discussed, the pandemic disrupted how we travel. More people worked from home, which brought less traffic, but paradoxically more crashes. Transit ridership plummeted, as did activity in downtown. More people hopped on bikes and got outdoors, but this was accompanied by more serious injuries and fatalities on our roads. So today, we're going to learn how the pandemic changed Greater Portland's travel patterns and its impact on employers and businesses. We'll explore which changes will likely continue and what we need to do to keep our downtowns and villages vibrant, walkers and bikers safe, and public transportation healthy. So with that, I'm going to invite our panelists to the stage. We have Christina Egan's, our moderator from the Greater Portland Council of Governments, Adam Causey from the town of Falmouth, Chris Chop, also from Greater Portland Council of Governments, Greg Jordan from Greater Portland Metro, and Dick Woodbury from the Maine Trail Coalition.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. This mic's off, and my mic's on. Okay, great. As Quincy mentioned, I'm going to give a quick presentation on some of the pandemic-induced changes to travel and transportation, many of which have ripple effects throughout our economy and really the way we get around. So let's jump right in. I've got the clicker. Nice. The first big one is the surge in remote work and hybrid work. And this has dramatic impacts, as we'll see in a couple slides, on really how we're getting around and kind of the life in downtowns, particularly in big cities, but also here locally. And in Maine and nationally, from 2019 to 2021, remote work essentially tripled. In Cumberland County, it's more like quadrupling. So pretty significant impact already on travel and how we get around. And with that comes this change in travel patterns and behavior. And as Quincy mentioned, our roads kind of surprisingly became less safe once fewer folks were on the road or traveling at different times for different purposes. And here we'll see vehicle miles traveled. So this is our kind of key metric for looking at travel trends by year in this case and by month. So here you can see the seasonality of travel, of roadway travel, as well as by year. And in red, you'll see the pandemic year, 2020. Started off like any other year, very similar to 2019 levels, which is shown in a lighter gray. And then pandemic hits in March and April, and travel absolutely plummets. And it slowly ticks back. And this is at that time when, this happens in our region. This is statewide vehicle miles traveled. This happens nationally, and this happens globally. And so with this, our air gets a little bit cleaner. Our water cleans up as well. These are, you probably remember photos from Venice at the time, of canals being the clearest they've been in decades. Fish are returning to the canals because we were driving less and there was far less emissions as a result. Travel starts picking back up as 2020 goes on, but it's still way below pre-pandemic levels. And then you could see, 2021 rolls around, and it's almost, it's pretty in lockstep with what we saw in 2019. And then same thing with 2022 and really our start of 2023. So in the state of Maine, vehicle travel is pretty much come back to pre-pandemic levels, which doesn't necessarily feel intuitive with all of the remote work and hybrid work. Folks are traveling for different reasons, for different purposes. I will say in our region, we don't have this complete data picture. We did pull some traffic counts on I-295 at permanent counters coming into the city of Portland and found that in some cases travel is still about 20% below pre-pandemic levels. So I think this story is still unfolding and it may depend a little bit where you're located. As Quincy mentioned, fatalities and serious injuries are trending up nationally across the state and in our region. And here we're looking at total crashes resulting in fatalities and serious injuries, primarily hospitalizations, over the last several years. You can see the numbers have ticked up, and maybe more concerning, the crash rate has ticked up. So this is the number of serious injuries and fatalities per 100 million vehicle miles traveled. And so you see both are ticking up in the state. And then when we look at it in our region, we can go back a little bit further. But 2020, crashes involving fatalities and serious injuries dipped in 2020 in our region, but the rate actually went up, and the rate is continuing to go up. And that's definitely a concern. In the United States in 2020, one pedestrian died every 88 minutes on our streets, for a total of 43,000 total fatalities. But we're seeing a greater share of pedestrians, cyclists, and vulnerable transportation users dying on our roads. Another trend, cycling reaches a higher gear. There's definitely like a boom in cycling and the bicycle industry during the pandemic. You could see that it was a $6.1 billion industry for bike sales and accessories in the United States in 2019. It ticks up and it reaches $8 billion by 2021. And you could see that in, this is a photo from Maine Medical Center's bike parking outside their south entrance. This is summer of 2020. And certainly a lot of people were biking to work at that time. This is another bike rack outside the Dana Center at Maine Medical Center. Again, full bike racks. So it became very popular, and more people were investing in bikes and getting out there and biking. And so we see more folks working hybrid and remote. We see about the same amount of vehicle travel, maybe less in our region. So what about public transit? Well, public transit was hit particularly hard during the pandemic. Here we look at trends, ridership trends for the Amtrak Downeaster, Casco Bay lines, and our region's 3 bus agencies on the bottom there. And you can see pandemic hits and ridership absolutely plummets. Still, essential workers are using public transit. In many ways, public transit operators and support staff are kind of the unsung heroes of the pandemic, still getting people to work, getting folks to grocery stores, to healthcare facilities. And you can see transit starting to tick back up. And Amtrak Downeaster and Casco Bay lines, as of the end of 2022, are in a pretty good place. They're roughly 90% of pre-pandemic levels. Our bus agency is only about 71%. And what that means is 71% of pre-pandemic ridership, 71% of fare revenue. And with that, it's leading many to be concerned that we're maybe facing a fiscal cliff, especially as pandemic relief funding dries up from the federal government, as operating costs have skyrocketed, and now agencies are in a place around the country in this unimaginable place where they're having to consider service reductions, which is not a good option. It's not what anyone wants, but it's the reality. And there's definitely support for public transit around the country. This looks at 2022, and 29 of the 36 ballot measures in support of public transit, providing funding for public transit passed in the United States in 22 alone. So there's still a lot of community support around public transit. Clearly, folks value it. Next one, downtowns feel a little bit different. This is primarily true in big cities. This is a photo I took in Minneapolis, but we feel it in smaller cities too, like Portland. And UC Berkeley did a study that looked at activity in 2019 compared to 2022. They used cell phone location data. Many of us have cell phones, probably have location data turned on. And they were able to kind of use that to measure the pulse of different metropolitan areas. And you could see huge drop-offs in activity in a lot of these bigger cities. Boston, you're seeing 52% of pre-pandemic levels. San Francisco, big tech hub, 31%. So this has a dramatic impact on our downtowns and our local businesses. And the big reason for this, well, remote work and hybrid work. The last one I wanted to touch on is just communities reimagining streets. In many cases, communities kind of came together to support local businesses, and one way they did that was by expanding outdoor dining options. So this is 4th Street in Portland, summer of 2020. That was closed to traffic. Exchange Street in summer of 2021, closed to traffic. By 2022, it had kind of resumed its pre-pandemic configuration, but still a lot of people out and about, which is good to see. There's a brass band playing on the sidewalk, bringing folks to the area. But then some of these areas in Portland and elsewhere kind of have continued. So we see Milk Street in Portland here, and it's still closed to traffic today. And so it's really given communities an opportunity to sort of reimagine what their streets are used for, beyond just traditional thinking about streets for vehicles and for cars. And so with that, I think that's everything I've got. Thank you all for coming today, and I'm excited to jump on the panel. I'm going to switch spots with Christina. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chris. Great data, great information. Before we jump in, I'm curious about all of you, about how many of you are working sometimes hybrid from home? Okay, how about primarily from home? Okay, and how many of you got outdoors more during the pandemic? How about hopped on a bike? Oh, that's a lot more people than I expected on hopping on a bike. Hopping on trails? Yeah, I discovered a lot more trails while I was on the pandemic, things that were near my house that I didn't even know was there. It was really exciting. All right, last question for you. Have you noticed a decrease in activity in the downtown of Portland or Westbrook or South Portland? If you have, raise your hand. Yeah, you've seen a little bit less activity. Yeah, so some of this resonates for you. So Chris has shared some bad news and some good news. I am not much for sitting in a puddle. So we are actually going to be focused more on opportunities today. And I'm really excited about this panel we have here. These are 4 people that have been doing great things to make our region even more terrific than it is. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to tell you who they all are. Chris Chop, he's our transportation director at the Greater Portland Council of Governments. So glad to have this superstar on my team. He works with cities and towns and transportation agencies to map out the future of the transportation system, and particularly to program the federal funds that go into our road, transit, sidewalks, and bikeways. Greg Jordan is one of those agencies that Chris works regularly with. Greg is the director of Metro, which is the bus agency that serves this area. It's the largest of our 7 transit agencies. It carries the most riders of all of them. Adam Causey, thank you, brings us the town perspective and the land use perspective. He is serving as the long-range planning director for Falmouth. And Dick Woodbury is an economist and a former state senator, my friend, and he also is taking his considerable talents and bringing them to the trails world. And he's been working with statewide and regional organizations to build out more trails in Maine. So if we could just have a round of applause for these awesome people. And Dick, I'm going to start with you. I'm going to ask you to kick us off. More people did discover the outdoors during the pandemic and are now walking and biking. Can you share with us why this is important?
Yeah, I might I might start by sharing a little of my personal experience. During my first 5 years as a dad, when I was closer to these guys' age, I lived outside Boston and I worked in Cambridge. And I biked 8 months a year on a bike path to my job. And that experience in my life, I loved having the exercise built into my day. I loved that I wasn't sitting in traffic, that I wasn't putting carbon emissions in the air. I loved that when I came home, my head was cleared and I could focus with a clear head on my young kids and family. And I loved that on the weekends, I could take my kids to these same trails and we could all enjoy them together. So it was a big part of my life back then. So fast forward, I've lived in Yarmouth for the last just about 30 years. And there happens to be a rail corridor that goes through Yarmouth that's not used by trains, and it's owned by the state as a public resource. So I've looked at this resource, and if it were a rail trail, I would use it to bike into Portland all the time. And going the other direction, it goes through the parks and public lands of the Royal River watershed, just some beautiful areas. If this were a rail trail, it would be one of the most popular rail trails in the country. So, put that into Portland's economic development thinking, on top of the benefits to public health, mental health, transportation, commuting, community enrichment. It would just be a tremendous resource, and it's the kind of thing that I think responds extremely well to some of the changes that Chris just described. So my work recently has been largely with the Main Trails Coalition, and we put together this vision of active transportation in the region that includes some arterials, like the rail trail I just described, but also the idea of complete streets that feed into, from these arterials, feed into the communities around them. And love to share more about that vision if there's time in the discussion.
That's great. We will definitely get to that. And Adam, I'm going to turn to you next. Dick ended his comments just about complete streets. And Falmouth is really transforming Route 1 into a complete street. I'm wondering if you could tell us how that stretch of road has changed and also how it will continue to change. And we do have a slide to show what Route 1 looks like right now. Many of you have probably seen it, but we'll put that up just so you can see it. So, Adam.
Sure. The Complete Streets model on Route 1 is really about making it safer for all modes of transportation. So whether you walk, bike, or ride a car, we think that public realm should be safe for those users. The town has centered its capital improvement plan on really making sure our public streets are safe in this way. Route 1 is such a huge part of Falmouth's identity. It's our growth area, and the town's total land use goals are to protect certain areas in traditional neighborhoods, but then drive growth to the areas with infrastructure. So we want to leverage those areas that already have the roads, water, the sewer infrastructure, and to align the land use we want to see on these corridors for our growth. And it also, we know that private investment follows public investment, and we want things to look nice. So this looks way nicer than it did before. So we're going to continue doing this. We're going to go further up Route 1 on the north end. We're going to try to deal with some problem intersections like Forsyth Road and Route 88 where it comes in, that funky intersection down there. But this, putting this type of infrastructure in place also allows us to make connections to areas that are off this road with additional sidewalks to get people to get used to coming to this place as a place to gather, as a place to shop, as a place to live, hopefully, as we get more housing.
That's great. Now, just to underscore, one of the points you made at the top of your comments was that you're trying to direct more growth to this corridor in order to preserve parts of Falmouth. And are you talking about open space?
Yeah. The town has been aggressive in protecting open space throughout its borders, but knowing that with the changing how commercial and retail has changed, we have opportunities. We have big pieces of land on Route 1 that are parking lots, that are buildings that at some point need to be redeveloped. So this is where we want to direct that growth, not just residential growth, but new types of commercial ventures, places that people want to be. Falmouth is in a lucky place being so close to Portland in the center of this region, but it has acted as a bedroom community in some sense, but there still is a desire to have that placemaking, and places like Route 1 can help us achieve that.
And Falmouth isn't the only place that's trying to pursue complete streets. So Chris, I know the region has recently adopted a complete streets policy. Can you explain what that means for people that are walking and biking?
Yeah, sure. 18 cities and towns in our region came together and approved a complete streets policy, which will kind of govern how federal transportation dollars are spent in our region. And hopefully, it'll have lasting impacts on kind of how we imagine our infrastructure and be much better for cyclists and pedestrians. It's really the whole concept is to try to look at streets holistically and design them for all users. So we're talking transit, pedestrians, cyclists, folks using mobility aid devices, and motorists. And Falmouth's a great example of Route 1, just kind of reimagining that space. It still functions well for vehicles. Maybe vehicles go a little bit slower, but as a result, everyone is a little bit safer. When a pedestrian is struck by a vehicle at 20 miles an hour, pedestrians' likelihood of survival is 90%. When that goes to 30 miles an hour, the survival goes down to 50%. When it's 40 miles an hour, it goes down to 10%. And so this whole idea is to slow traffic a little bit and really balance the needs of all users and create a much safer environment.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, making streets safer for everybody is a really important goal. And Dick, you mentioned earlier that these complete streets can feed into a trail system. I think we've got another slide for the audience that is the plan. If you could describe a little bit, what is the Trails plan for Maine?
Yeah, so this idea of complete streets is great for getting around communities themselves, but the vision that the Maine Trails Coalition has tried to put together is that we also need what we've called arterials, active transportation arterials, that travel, but for people who want to travel between communities. And the place you want to put those are on the corridors where people tend to move and want to travel by bike or walking or so forth. So we've developed this plan, and it's actually a statewide plan, but I focused in this slide on the greater Portland region. And we imagine these active transportation arterials going from Portland down to the south through South Portland and Scarborough and Biddeford and Saco, so forth, on a trail, which is the Eastern Trail vision. A lot of it is done already. Going west through Westbrook and Gorham and Windham and on all the way to the New Hampshire border on another arterial corridor. Going north through Falmouth, Cumberland, Yarmouth, up to Brunswick, and even going across to Lewiston, Auburn on these arterials. Now, a fair number of these arterials that we've described are on what used to be active rail corridors, but that aren't used by trains anymore. So, for example, if you look at the map we're looking at right now, going south from Portland, that trail corridor that you see is the old Eastern Railroad that's no longer used by trains. But that's not stopped at all having the Downeaster exist as a train corridor. It's just a different, it's a prioritizing one corridor for trains and one corridor for trails. We can do the exact same thing on the corridors north of Portland. And there's actually another slide. This is the some of the key corridors that go north from Portland. The yellow that you're looking at in this slide is the Downeaster that comes up from Boston and goes through Portland and then out to Freeport and on to Brunswick. It could fork left at Royal Junction, that same yellow track, and proceed on to Lewiston, Auburn, on to Bangor, on to Montreal. All the possibilities that we think we might want to engage in can happen on the active yellow corridor that we're looking at here, while that purple corridor is what we envision being part of this active transportation vision as a trail. So that's how we're kind of trying to integrate this whole vision of what to do going forward with creating greater active transportation possibilities.
So I'm not particularly athletic. I don't know how many of you get out and do like the hills on the bikes, but one of the great things about trails is that they can be really flat if they're using old rail corridors. The other great thing is technology is innovated now to get e-bikes. Who has an e-bike here? Does anyone have an e-bike? Are they awesome? Yeah, I mean, they're just like so great to get around on. So thank you, Dick, for sharing that plan. I want to turn now for the plan on transit, public transportation. We heard from Chris that there has been a slow rebuilding of ridership, but we're not fully recovered from the pandemic. And Greg, can you tell us what the plan is for public transportation and help us understand what's out there and what needs to change?
Sure. So let me start by setting the table a little bit in terms of what our system looks like today. Obviously, we have a multimodal system in our region, which is great. As Chris mentioned earlier, or Christina, we have 7 transit agencies in our region. We have a great rail system going down to Boston from Brunswick. We have the Casco Bay Ferry Service transporting people from the islands to the mainland. And we have really 5 agencies providing a combination of bus and what we call demand response service in our region. And so on the bus and demand response side, that's a lot of agencies trying to work together to provide as seamless and simple a system as we can for the region. That hasn't changed over the last many years, but one of our goals in this region is to make the system more seamless and simple for riders. There has been talk in our region for a long time about the virtues of consolidating some of these agencies, and that's not really the most important thing to be thinking about. The most important thing to be thinking about is what is the user experience? For the user, for the rider, for the passenger, and for the public, it's best if they can perceive, understand, and use as simple and as single a system as they possibly can. Now, Chris mentioned, our ridership on public transit did take a nosedive during the pandemic. We had 4.7 million boardings in our region for all the transit agencies in the greater Portland region. That dropped down to about 50% during the depths of the pandemic. It's been recovering, as Chris noted earlier. But we have a ways to go, especially on the bus side, and for some of the reasons that we'll keep talking about here related to the pandemic and the after effects. But one of the ways we're trying to move our system forward is through a plan called Transit Together, which GPCOG has been leading, which is meant to do exactly what I've been talking about, making our system more simple, seamless, and usable for the riders. So better connections between routes and the agencies, simpler bus stops, more frequent service where it's needed the most in our region, and introducing new technologies and new services to bring riders back to our system. So that's kind of where we're headed, and a little bit where we've been.
And as you think about how you're going to be capturing new markets, how do you think those improvements are going to kind of shift from the traditional commute ridership market to different trip purposes? Can you speak a little bit to some of those innovations that you're looking at?
Right. I mean, we've seen a drop-off in commuter activity. The hands raised earlier indicate that more people, of course, are working from home, going to school through remote technology at times as well. And we're still seeing the need for travel. Even though people are working from home, going to school from home, they're still traveling around their neighborhood. They're still making trips throughout their day, even if they're working from home. So the need for travel, and we've seen from the data that the traffic has come back. So we still have the problems of traffic congestion and growing volumes of traffic congestion in our city. And if we can provide a better transit system, a better mobility system connected to trails, connected to complete streets, connected to great placemaking in our towns, villages, and urban centers, more people will, I'm convinced, use transit to get around, even if they're not necessarily going to a job in downtown Portland as often as they used to.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, when we think about what people really want if they're going to jump on public transportation, we know through surveys that people want frequency, they want convenience, they want to understand how one system connects to another. So, Greg, you talked about all of those things. But also top of the list is people want fast service. And Chris, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the work your team is doing to develop a brand new option for this region.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're exploring rapid transit options between Gorham, Westbrook, and Portland as a way to really attract new riders and grow the service and provide a really high quality, reliable, convenient, fast service. So rapid transit is a little bit different than the bus service that you see around our region. Rapid transit could be streetcar, it could be light rail, or it could be bus rapid transit, which is like a very high caliber version of bus service that tends to have bigger buses, dedicated bus lanes, so bus only lanes for portions of the corridor or entire corridors in some cases. You can go down and check out Boston's on Columbus Avenue. There's other places around the country. Cleveland's Healthline is very famous. But the idea is, to provide this very high quality service with these, with unique branding and really nice stops and stations, and to make it, regardless of whether it's rail or bus service, kind of make it look and feel like this permanent fixture in the transportation network. And in many places around the country, Cleveland included, it's also helped galvanize and really catalyze real estate development along the corridor and spur growth along the corridor. So there's a lot of opportunity there. We're still evaluating different alternatives, ways to get from Gorham to Portland, what makes sense. We're looking at the available right-of-way, how much space is there for all of these different transportation users, and hopefully come up with a plan and wrap up sometime this summer, fall, and get an application into the federal government to actually build this thing.
Very
Yeah,
exciting.
exciting.
Thank you. Yeah. We have another innovation also that I know we're exploring in transit called microtransit. And Greg, I'm wondering if you could explain how that might fit into the future.
Sure. Microtransit is a solution to what we call the first mile, last mile problem. And if you're not familiar with what that is, that means for a transit system to operate, at its highest capacity, the difficulty is getting people from their homes sometimes to a bus stop. They may live more than half a mile, or a couple of miles away, and making that trip, if there's not a lot of coverage in the region, can be difficult. So what the opportunity with microtransit, and to be simple about it, it really is basically kind of like Uber, but in a public transit environment. But what sets it apart from Uber is the fact that it's more affordable for the riders. It's directly linked into the transit network. And we have accessible vehicles, we will have accessible vehicles, and drivers are, of course, trained and screened and work within our system to provide great service to our riders.
And when you say accessible, you mean that it's accessible to people with disabilities?
That's correct, yeah. It's accessible to persons using wheelchairs or other mobility devices. And so the opportunity here really is to widen our coverage area without the high cost and sort of, maybe inefficiency of running fixed route buses down residential or neighborhood streets. And it's more efficient, and it can hook up and link with the transit network. It can provide a lot of mobility within a small, maybe urban village area, neighborhood area, that mobility that wasn't there before. And then also, importantly, hook into the transit system. And so a good example of this, and where we are going to begin testing this kind of service, is going to be in the town of Falmouth, actually, later this year. We're going to deploy a microtransit pilot project that will provide coverage to the town of Falmouth broadly. It may be expanded a little bit beyond Falmouth in the first phase. It'll provide mobility to the town village and around the town, but also, importantly, hook into the main corridor fixed route system and provide that easy transfer, seamless transfer to the main corridor service, getting you into Portland or maybe north to Freeport or Brunswick. So that's the idea.
Yeah, great for rural areas. And I know, like rapid transit, microtransit has been tried successfully in other parts of the country, and we're just introducing it here this spring. And Adam, what do you think about the potential for microtransit in your town?
We're very excited. The town is partnering with Metro. We are committed to helping fund this pilot project to help design it. And actually, I talked to someone, a business owner this morning in this room, who had heard about it and wanted to talk to me about it. So I think it's validating that there's a need to get employees to where they need to go from that person's perspective, but also just to feed, again, that investment that are on the major routes along Route 1, and hopefully this can spread to other areas.
That's great. And Adam, I'm going to stick with you for a second because we're going to pivot away from public transportation to what connects to public transportation, which is housing and land use. And can you paint a picture for all of us just about why where housing goes matters for public transportation?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's all about that convenience, that flexibility, and putting that existing infrastructure to use. Towns, regions, the state spends a lot of money on transportation infrastructure, and we need to put the riders where they need to be. And it just so happens that for us on Route 1, it aligns with our land use goals about diversifying the mix that we have along Route 1 and others. You know, if you've been out to Route 100, Gray Road, you see the housing that is being built out there, and we have the same Complete Streets program there with sidewalks, street lights. So it doesn't have to be in a totally busy commercial context. It can be a little bit less. But again, those people that live proximate to this infrastructure that we've already paid for and are continuing to pay for are your employees, they're your customers, they're new business owners, they're the new leaders of the community. So that's why it's important to us to get this right.
That's great. And in Falmouth, you're doing that kind of focusing of development around places that are already served by infrastructure and make it easier for people to walk, bike, take transit. Chris, I'm going to turn to you about the region, because that sounds like a good regional strategy. And we'll put a couple slides up next just showing where people are right now, and then ask you to describe a little bit about how we need to grow. So you want to narrate us through these?
Yeah, sure. We're looking at the region now, and on the next slide, I think we'll look at population, where people are living. You can see, the huge cluster right on the Portland Peninsula, and then kind of following some of the, the main roadway arterials coming out of Portland. But a lot of our existing development, I would say, is in Portland Peninsula. But then you can see, we have grown all over the place too. So we're, growing in rural areas, and there's different nodes. So in the next slide, we'll look at where jobs are, and this is much more consolidated. So you can see really jobs are on these main roadways. I know you can't see the roadways, but Route 1, out on to Forest Avenue, Brighton Avenue, Washington Avenue, most of the jobs are there. So it's all about, connecting people from their homes to work, and public transit's one way to do that. And then on the next slide, this looks at a map of developed areas in red, conserved land in green. You got mixed forests also in green, and then crops, pasture, and grassland in yellow. And really our strategy in our long-range transportation plan, Connect 2045, is to try to focus as much as possible on developing in these areas that are red. We want to keep the green and the yellow on this map, and really focus development along these key corridors and in these key communities, village centers, downtowns. We see a lot of opportunity there, and again, it's good for the environment. People are maybe driving a little bit less. It's good for local business because you can access local businesses in your village center or community, and it's good for public transit as well because again, we're focusing people where public transit already is, and thereby, encouraging use and making it really easy for people to use the system. And that ridership fare revenue is great for the system to be reinvested in the public transit network.
It also goes back to something you said earlier about some of the concerns we have about our downtowns, that if we're doubling down on where housing and development goes in our downtowns, it means there's more people there and can make it more lively.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think we've estimated that by 2030 we'll need another 20,000 houses and apartments. And so there's a lot of opportunity.
People hear that? 20,000 new units in Greater Portland by 2030.
So big number, and there's obviously different ways to do that. And to achieve that goal, it's developing again in these key areas, incentivizing development there, if your communities. And then I know developers are getting creative in the office market here in Portland and around the country. We're converting Class B office space to residential. which is kind of hopefully a win-win for the development community, but also for folks that want to live in these communities. And again, it's consolidating growth, which is a good thing.
So we're going to turn to your questions in just a moment, but so start thinking about what you'd like to ask this talented group of people. I am going to ask one last question, though, because we want to always leave action-oriented, asking you to do things to support the future of the region. So I'd like to ask each of you what you think businesses and individuals can do in order to help with the transportation system and help with the future growth and development of the region. And we'll just go right down the line. So Greg, can I start with you?
Sure. I think the most important thing that you could help us with is working with us on getting transit passes into the hands of your employees, the people you represent. I was talking with Quincy earlier. We had this conversation back in 2019, and we were poised and ready to meet with, I think, a lot of you to get all of you onto our new transit pass programs. And the pandemic hit, and we sort of took a bit of a breather on that. But we're back, we're ready. We want to get as many employers onto pass programs as we can. It's been a great success for transit in the region. We have the University of Southern Maine Medical Center, Southern Maine Community College, a host of other institutions around the region that work with us on passes for their employees, for their students, and it really has been probably the principal source of ridership generation in this region. And so I think this can be a benefit for you, your bottom line, and your employees.
Great. Thank you, Greg. Dick?
Yeah, the concept of active transportation arterials is kind of new to the state, and this is the first time the Maine Department of Transportation has put out an actual active transportation plan for the state. And I think a key early thing to do is just to increase awareness, and having the business community's partnership in increasing awareness about this kind of a active transportation vision would be hugely helpful.
That's great. And actually, we didn't really touch on this, but active transportation corridors generate more economic development.
Absolutely.
Yeah, great. Adam?
I would say engage with your local government. We have plans and programs, but the market moves faster than the government can. As we're looking to diversify and grow in the areas we want to grow, we have things like zoning codes and ordinances on the books that may not meet the market, and sometimes it can take some time to change that. So I would say engage. We can speak the same language, we can talk. The time frames sometimes are a little different, but I think we want to get to the same direction. And so that communication is key. And show up and support the projects and programs that you do agree with. Because usually when we're at public meetings, we hear from those that don't want the things. And we know that there are opportunities out there to collaborate and to do things that we all want to see happen.
And I'll just underscore one thing about that. When we think about where housing is proposed, it's usually most difficult to actually get it approved in places where people already live and work, which is those downtowns that Chris showed you on that map. So if you see projects that you feel will increase the number of homes in these areas, it's great to have people stand up for that. And it's a real critical thing that I think the business community can help with. Chris?
I'll duplicate what Greg said and also what Adam said. These past programs are very successful. I was actually working at Maine Medical Center and worked with Greg when we launched the program. We saw a huge spike in bus ridership at Maine Medical Center because it instantly became so easy for employees to hop on the bus, show their badge, which everyone carries with them at all times, board the bus, not worry about paying, and it's just made for a really seamless experience. Second piece was engagement. Yeah, let your locally elected officials know what your priorities are, and let Maine DOT, Maine Department of Transportation, know what your priorities are. If you want safer streets, if you want complete streets, then let them know that, because they're always looking for public input and how they kind of shape their projects. A lot of the funding in this state funnels through Maine Department of Transportation, including a lot of the projects that we have in our communities in this region. So they're a really important piece of this. I think they'd want to hear from you.
Great. All right, we'd like to turn to you, and we want to take the most number of questions possible in order to make sure everybody has an opportunity. So I'm going to ask you to ask your question briefly and make sure that your question actually has a question mark at the end, all right? We'd love to see who has the first question. All right.
Okay.
So I think we've got the microphones.
Sure.
I'm going to let
Kevin
the
Roach.
folks with the microphones choose the questioners because I can't see that well with the lights.
Kevin Roach from EcoMaine.
Hi, Kevin.
Question: how will the Gorham connector or the Gorham spur from the mall to Gorham impact your vision?
Excellent question, Kevin. And I'm wondering if maybe, Chris, you want to handle that vis-a-vis the rapid transit project?
Yeah, so we've got two transportation projects in our region looking at connections between Gorham and Portland. One is the rapid transit project that I mentioned earlier. So major public transit investment. And the other one, Maine Turnpike Authority is leading the proposed Gorham connector, which is a limited access highway connecting South Gorham to Portland, kind of via an interchange in South Portland. I know the project teams are working closely together on these two projects, but they are very different. I think it remains to be seen how one will impact the other. It is possible that, a scenario where the Gorham connector is built, it's possible that that could, in some ways, cannibalize transit ridership. And so that is certainly a concern, and that's why it's important for these projects to be kind of in lockstep to make sure that we're still supporting public transit and hopefully we're working towards the same goals and not different goals.
And also, I know the Turnpike Authority is working with some of the towns kind of in the further west area to try to plan the land use so that we don't create a lot of urban sprawl from that project. So again, it's kind of like making sure that the housing is going in places where people are already living and working mostly. Great. Yes?
Good morning. You guys are amazing, and the Department of Transportation keeping transportation going during the pandemic was absolutely commendable, so thank you very much. My name is Margot Walsh. I own MainWorks. We employ kind of the least of the workforce for whom the first and last mile is the biggest obstacle, so I'm really grateful for that. And I also work with the early morning people who are needing to be at work by 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, and transport is a bit lighter at that time. So I wonder who's leading the charge for micro-transport, first and last mile concept, and whether they could be working with private taxi companies to collaborate.
Great question for Greg.
Yes, so as I said earlier, we are planning to advance a microtransit project later this year with Town of Falmouth. We hope to be able to expand that model to more sort of geographic zones around, say, Gorham in support of the Husky line or maybe a future rapid transit line, or around the town of Freeport, getting those individuals in from their outlying residential areas to downtown Freeport to connect with the breeze, to get them into Portland, to get to their jobs, as you're indicating. There have been, and I think we are certainly open to, partnerships with the private sector, whether it's taxi companies or even Uber and Lyft themselves. There have been projects where transit agencies across the country have partnered with those companies to try to augment their transit systems, so it's not something that's off the table. I think, as I said earlier, we have some concern about deploying this service in a way that's very integrated with the transit system, having some degree of I guess, control over the qualifications of drivers, the background of drivers, the accessibility of vehicles, things like that. So there are opportunities to partner with the private sector on this, and I think we should be exploring those. But we are moving forward with an internal solution, at least this year.
Thank you, Marco.
Hi, my name's Tony Donovan. My question and his little background, I'm managing director of the Maine Rail Transit Coalition. I've worked as a realtor in Maine for the past 30 years. My specialty is site locational development at train stations. The Portland Transportation Center and the Brunswick Main Street Station are a couple examples of my work. MRTC, Maine Rail Transit, is an advocacy organization educating interested parties, including Maine legislators, on the value of using Maine railways that exist in the state of Maine.
Tony, I'm going to make
And we
sure
work
you have
with
a
passenger
question in
train-
there.
I have a question.
Okay, let's hear it.
And we work with passenger train operators as we consider site locations of development at potential train station locations along the corridors. Currently, we are designing a service plan for interurban light rail on the railroads in the state of Maine.
And your question.
Our immediate route is the St.
Tony.
Lawrence Atlantic. I'm going to get to that in 1 second.
Yeah, we just want to make sure that everybody has a chance to ask questions.
Okay, we'll get right to it then.
Thank you.
We are working with hybrid electric and battery electric rail cars. We've engaged architects and engineers for reconstruction of the rail lines. We have station site locations along the fixed guideway. My question is coming right now. With the exception of a really good guy, Greg Jordan does a great job, one of the best in the country actually. Everyone on that stage has voted to remove the state-owned railroads for bikeways, rip up the main state railroad corridors for bikes. So I guess my question is, do you really think that that's a good use for future transportation in the state of Maine? Because you don't want to hear what I have to say, but we are doing it while you are moving to rip up the railroad corridors. Do you think that's a good idea?
Thank you, Tony, for the question. Would love to hear your perspective, Dick, on kind of this tension that can sometimes arise between using a corridor for a rail line or a trail line, which I think is what Tony's getting at.
Yeah, I mean, the trails community is very much behind multimodal approaches to transportation. In the last 5 years, there have been quite a number of analyses of the existing rail infrastructure in the state. 2018, 2019, there was analysis of the corridor from Portland to Lewiston, Auburn. And then just this year, the state put out a Main State Trail Plan. There was a Rail Corridor Use Advisory Council that did an analysis. And it looks specifically at what makes the most sense for particular corridors. And that's why I put up the slide a little bit earlier, that one can achieve rail and trail by prioritizing certain corridors for trains and certain corridors for trails. And there are logical ways to make that prioritization. We totally support that. The other thing I'll just say that comes out of a lot of these studies is that the population density of a lot of Maine just doesn't meet what the federal government requires for funding of rail infrastructure. So as much as I think it's super exciting to find a way to have trains continue from the Portland Transportation Center up to Lewiston, Auburn, and Waterville, and Bangor, and potentially Montreal, hugely exciting concept. I'd love to see it happen. It's going to be a different corridor than the ones we're trying to do for trails.
Great, thank you, Dick. Other questions? Yeah.
Bill Higgins, Homeless Advocacy for All. I was a community transportation leader for Greater Portland Council of Governments last year. Can we describe the Project 2045 a little bit? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And Bill, thank you so much for serving as a community transportation leader. These are folks that have engaged in the decision-making process, which is very complicated, overcomplicated, and really trying to bring their perspectives to how we improve the transportation future for all of us. Chris, you want to describe a little bit about Connect 45 in like 30 seconds?
Sure. Yeah, so this is the region's long-range multimodal transportation plan. It's kind of our guidebook for our plans, policies, investments over the next 25 years. The plan has a pretty ambitious emissions reduction goal of 70% reduction by 2045, and the plan has a list of what we call fiscally constrained projects, transportation projects that we anticipate having funding for over the next 25 years. This shows to federal partners in Maine Department of Transportation that as a region we have our act together, we have our ducks in a row, we've prioritized projects, and that we're hopefully more competitive for federal funding programs as a result. So that's kind of the big picture. There's a lot in there. www.connect2045.org if you want to check it out.
Shameless plugging. We have to have that, right? I think we have time for one last question. Is that Peter Mills? All right. Nice to see you, Peter.
It's good to be here. I don't want to get into this bike versus rail fight, but I am a bike rider. When I first worked in Monument Square, my first legal job 50 years ago, I rode a bike in from Stroudwater, and I did fine until I went to a happy hour at the end of one day, and I fell off my bike at St. John Street and ruined a perfectly good suit. But I kept riding.
Yes, drive your bikes sober.
Fortunately, I wasn't driving a car. That's a dirty. Don't anybody repeat that story. I I walk a lot now. I'm almost 80, and I love walking in Portland because it's that kind of city. But one of the concerns I have is standing on Congress Street with my dog and looking out at the buses going by. And I see a Metro bus, and I see a South Portland bus, and right behind it I see a Biddeford Zoom bus. Oh, and there's the RTP bus, maybe two of them. Folks, the Chamber has been concerned about this for at least a decade or more. The ideal situation here would be if we had a common system all the way from Brunswick to Biddeford. Integrate the Route 1 corridor, open up these routes out on 302, Route 22, Route 25. All of these pathways into Portland deserve transit. The Turnpike has offered and has in fact had a history of supporting transit in the past. We want to support a cohesive, organized, efficient system. The system now is running on federal dollar. It's not
Peter, I'm going to ask you also for a question.
All right. I think that's a good idea, don't you? No,
Thank you, Peter.
Say that Greg's my hero in this because he's tried and done a wonderful job of integrating efforts among the different agencies and trying to get a common system out of it all. Even though they're operated separately, but they really should be one. Frankly, they should be one organization. I think that would be a good idea. Don't you? Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And that wasn't really a question, so I'm going to actually end our program there because we're just about out of time. But I do want to thank you all. And it wouldn't be a transportation panel if we didn't have controversy. That's like, it sounds like it's really boring transportation, but it's not. It's complicated, and it's really fun, and it's really meaningful to our future. So really appreciate all of you being here today. And I'm going to ask Quincy to close us out.
Thank you, Christina. Peter, that was a great wrap. I couldn't have wrapped it better myself. This was a spicy conversation. So I want to thank our panelists. Thank you for being here and sharing your knowledge and your expertise and your passion for transportation. Christina, a million thank yous. She is a wonderful, wonderful partner with the Chamber. All of GPCOG is, and you did a phenomenal job moderating, so thank you. Please, a round of applause for our panelists and moderator. And as Greg had mentioned, there is much more to come on this topic. We do want to create more opportunities for employers, employees alike to engage in the work that is happening in our region around transportation, learn how you too can figure out different modes of transport as you are going to the office. So stay tuned for many more opportunities to engage. Please join us here May 5th. We have another really great presentation. We're going to look at the pretty extraordinary economic development happening in Westbrook, namely the Rock Row project. So we will be joined by Mayor Mike Foley of Westbrook, as well as Josh Levy from Waterstone. So thank you for being here, and we hope to see you next month.